Hi there. Today we are going to pick up with Chapter 3 of Because of Winn, Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. I started in on Winn Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him good. I used my own hairbrush, and I worked real hard at the knots and patches and the fur stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I told him how we were alike. See, I said, you don't have a family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old, and I can't hardly remember her, and I bet you don't remember your mama much either, so we're almost like orphans. Winn Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody understand his situation. I nodded my head at him, and I went on talking. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. You know what, I said. Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard, more than I ever did when I was in Watley. Winn Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back. But he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. Winn Dixie looked at me hard, like he was trying to say something. What? I said, and he stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn Dixie looked at me so hard he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, Winn Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur that he did have was cleaned up nice, and it was all shiny and soft. You could still see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into sneezing fit every time I tried brushing him with my toothbrush. Finally, I just had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better. So I took him into the trailer, and I showed him to the preacher. Daddy, I said. He said. He was working on a sermon, kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I want to show you the new Winn Dixie. The preacher put down his pencil and he rubbed his nose, and finally he looked up. Well, he said, smiling real big at Winn Dixie. Well, now, don't you look handsome? Winn Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He bent over and he put his head in the preacher's lap. Well, he smells nice, too, said the preacher. He rubbed Winn Dixie's head and he looked into his eyes. Daddy? I said real quick before I lost my nerve. I've been talking to Winn Dixie. Is that right? The preacher said, and he scratched Winn Dixie's head. I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I am 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10, that's all. The preacher stopped rubbing Winn Dixie's head, held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head back into that shell. 1 thing for each year I've been alive, I told him, please. Winn Dixie looked at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed. He said to Winn Dixie, I should have guessed you were going to be trouble. And then he looked down at me. Come on, Opal, he said, sit down, and I will tell you 10 things about your mama. 1, the preacher said. We were sitting on the couch, and Winn Dixie was sitting between us. Winn Dixie had already decided he liked the couch a lot. 1, the preacher said again. Winn Dixie looked up at him kind of hard. Your mama was funny. She could make just about anybody laugh. 2, he said. She had red hair and freckles. Just like me, I said. Just like you, the preacher nodded. 3, she liked to plant things. She had a talent for it. She could stick a tire in the ground and grow a car. Winn Dixie started chewing on his paw, and I tapped him on the head to make him stop. 4, said the preacher. She could run fast. If you were racing her, you could never let her get a head start because she would beat you for sure. I'm that way too, I said. Back home in Watley, I raced Liam Fullerton and I beat him. And he said it wasn't fair because boys and girls shouldn't race each other to begin with. And I told him he was a sore loser. The preacher nodded. He was quiet for a minute. I'm ready for number 5, I told him. 5, he said. She couldn't cook. She burned everything, including water. She had a hard time opening a can of beans. She couldn't make heads or tail of a piece of meat. 6, the preacher rubbed his nose and looked at the ceiling. Winn Dixie looked up too. Number 6. is that your mama loved a story. She would sit and listen to stories all day long. She loved to be told a story. She especially liked funny ones. Stories that made her laugh. The preacher nodded his head like he was agreeing with himself. What's 7? I asked. Let's see. She knew all the constellations, every planet in the nighttime sky, every last one of them. She could name them and point them out, and she never got tired of looking up at them. Number 8, said the preacher with his eyes closed, was that she hated being a preacher's wife. She said she couldn't stand having the ladies at church judge what she was wearing and what she was cooking and how she was singing. She said it made her feel like a bug under a microscope. When Dixie laid down on the couch, he put his nose in the preacher's lap and his tail in mine. 10, said the preacher. 9, I told him. 9, said the preacher. She drank. She drank beer and whiskey and wine, and sometimes she couldn't stop drinking. And that made me and your mama fight quite a bit. Number 10, he said with a long sigh. Number 10 is that your mama loved you. She loved you very much. But she left me, I told him. She left us, the preacher said softly. I could see him pulling into his old turtle shell. She packed up her bags and she left us, and she did not leave one thing behind. Okay, I said. I got up off the couch when Dixie hopped up too. Thank you for telling me, I said. I went back to my room and I wrote down all 10 things that the preacher had told me. I wrote them down just the way he had said them to me so that I wouldn't forget them. And then I read them all out loud to Winn Dixie. And then when I had memorized them all, I wanted to know those 10 things inside and out. That way, if my mama ever came back, I could recognize her, and I'll be able to grab her and hold on tight and not let her get away from me. Winn Dixie couldn't stand to be left alone. We found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he always pulled all the cushions off the couch and all the toilet paper off the roll. So we started tying him outside with a rope when we left. But that didn't work either. Winn Dixie howled until Samuel, Mrs. Detweiler's dog, started howling too. And that was exactly the kind of noise that people in an all-adult trailer park do not like to hear. He just doesn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's just take him with us. I couldn't understand the way Winn Dixie felt. I could understand the way Winn Dixie felt. Getting left behind probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we just took Winn Dixie, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi wasn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a Pick It Quick store, and when you walked in the front door, the first thing you see is the Pick It Quick motto. It's written on the floor in little tiny red tiles that make great big letters that say, "Pick, pick, pick, quick, quick, quick." The preacher tried painting over those tiles, but the letters won't stay covered up, so the preacher had just given up and let them be. The other thing about the Open Arms is that is different from other churches is that there aren't any pews. People bring their own fold-up chairs and lawn chairs, and so sometimes it looks more like the congregation is watching a parade or sitting at a barbecue instead of being at church. It's kind of a strange church, and I thought Winn Dixie would fit right in. But the first time we brought Winn Dixie to the Open Arms, the preacher tied him outside the front door. "Why did we bring him all the way here just to tie him up?" I said to the preacher. "Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal," the preacher said. "That's why." He tied Winn Dixie up to a tree and said how there was lots of shade for him and that ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started and there was someone singing and someone sharing and someone praying. And then the preacher started preaching and wasn't but 2 or 3 words into his sermon when there was a terrible howl coming from outside. The preacher tried to ignore it. "Today," he said. "Ow!" said Winn Dixie. "Please," said the preacher. "Ow!" said Winn Dixie again. "Friends," said the preacher. "Ow!" wailed Winn Dixie. Everyone turned in their lawn chairs and fold-up chairs, and they looked at one another. "Opal," said the preacher. "Oh!" said Winn Dixie. "Yes, sir," I said. "Go get that dog," he yelled. "Yes, sir," I yelled back. And I went outside and I untied Winn Dixie and I brought him inside and he sat down beside me and he smiled up at the preacher. The preacher couldn't help it. He smiled back. Winn Dixie had that effect on him. And so the preacher started preaching again and Winn Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears this way and that and trying to catch all the words. And everything would have been all right except that a mouse ran across the floor. The Open Arms had mice. They were there from when it was a Picket Quick, and there were lots of good things to eat in the building. And when the Picket Quick became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, the mice stayed around to eat all the leftover crumbs from the potluck suppers. The preacher kept on saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did. Because the truth is, he couldn't stand the thought of hurting anyone or anything, even a mouse. Well, Winn-Dixie saw that mouse, and he was up and after him. 1 minute, everything was quiet and serious, and the preacher was going on, and the next minute, the Winn-Dixie looked like a furry bullet shooting across the building, chasing that mouse. He was barking, and his feet were skidding all over the polished Picket Quick floor, and people were clapping and hollering and pointing. They really went wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught the mouse. "I have never in my life seen a dog catch a mouse," said Mrs. Nordley. She was sitting next to me. "He's a special dog," I told her. "I imagine so," she said back. Winn-Dixie stood up there in front of the whole church, wagging his tail, holding that mouse real careful in his mouth, holding him tight but not squishing him. "I believe that mutt has got some retriever in him," said someone behind him. "That's a hunting dog." Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it at his feet. And when the mouse tried to get away, Winn-Dixie put his paw right on that mouse's tail. And he smiled up at the preacher, and he showed him all of his teeth. And the preacher looked down at the mouse, and he looked at Winn-Dixie, and he looked at me, and he rubbed his nose, and it got real quiet in the Picket Quick. "Let us pray," the preacher finally said, "for this mouse." And everybody started laughing and clapping, and the preacher picked up the mouse by the tail, and he walked and he threw it out the front door of the Picket Quick, and everybody applauded again. And then he came back, and we all prayed together. I prayed for my mama. I told God how much she would have enjoyed hearing the story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh. I asked God if maybe I could be the one to tell her that story someday. And then I asked God about how I was then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I didn't know any kids, only the ones from church, and there weren't that many kids at the Open Arms, just Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry, two boys who weren't twins, but they looked like they were, and Amanda Wilkinson, whose face was always pinched up like she was smelling something real bad, and Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend anyway, because they probably thought I'd tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong, and then they would get in trouble with God or their parents. So I told God that I was lonely, even having Winn-Dixie. And finally I prayed for that mouse, like the preacher suggested. I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. I prayed that he landed on a nice, soft patch of grass. And that is the end of chapters 4, 5, and 6. No, 3, 4, and 5. 3, 4, and 5. We will start on chapter 6 tomorrow.